discrimination and harassment to a wider range of problems in society? Or should we leave it so it's just around sex and not on other issues? Or is there a problem singling out gender or sex and reduce it in some way or pull it back? And that was, in many ways, since I think Title IX, in ways that a lot of people discussed, including Jennifer and others, and Greg and the panel earlier this morning, is having a big effect on university culture. I think it's a question that matters deeply to us. Is this the way we want to go about dealing with and addressing real problems on our campuses? And so I'm wondering if, Alexandra, you want to start? Yeah.
Stealing the microphone from you. So first I would say, Title IX is a sex discrimination statute. There are analogous statutes covering race, national origin, and disability discrimination on campuses. And if you look at the past 30 years of enforcement of civil rights law in schools, K-12 and higher ed, we learn from these different contexts. So there was very meaningful race harassment guidance that came out many years before the spate of sexual harassment guidance that we have just seen. And that then informed the ways that schools responded to harassment on the basis of multiple axes of identity. I don't think that anyone here would say that schools' responses to gender violence right now are perfect. I think that both from the perspective of victims and from accused students. What I feel strongly there are two reasons why I want to say yes in a qualified way to your question, though.
That we should expand it.
Yes, qualified. One is that I think it is dangerous when we talk about sex discrimination in a vacuum, and I would rather see trans-substantive anti-discrimination regimes on campuses that are able to deal with intersectional claims and that don't risk attracting a certain rape exceptionalist narrative on either side, including the idea that disciplinary procedures for rape need to be more criminal-like than others because there's something especially criminal about rape. The second is that I feel strongly that we continue a regime of robust civil rights enforcement by the Office for Civil Rights. I know there are a lot of people on the stage who are not happy with OCR right now, and we can debate sort of particular decisions that they have made. But so no school had ever been found non-compliant with Title IX for sexual assault before Catherine Lehman. And that is huge. And schools knew they could get away with it.
Isn't that a problem from your point of view?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
and that's probably because if any school were found non-compliant, as I understand it, they'd basically go out of business.
That's not right. So you can have a school can be found non-compliant without their funding being revoked, and that has incredible expressive value to have an agency say, this law has actual meaning. You are actually expected to follow the civil rights mandate.
Okay. Okay, Janet, Deroy.
I agree with some of what Alexandra says, but not all. I think that the intersectional issue is huge, and for instance, there's no obligation in the Title IX office to be on the lookout for discrimination on the basis of disability or discrimination on the basis of race in the cases. They have a general obligation, but it's not a specific office responsibility. What Alexandra is suggesting would extend that obligation and build it in to the sex-oriented enforcement. The downside is that all the terrible things that have built up inside Title IX enforcement would then be exported to other forms of discrimination, anti-discrimination enforcement. And I'm really puzzled about what the answer is, right? Because some of those things are so terrible. I really think it is a moment to think about, be careful what you ask for. One of the things to think about is that it's handing over the justice project to bureaucratic experts whose job is compliance with government mandates and who, as I was trying to say earlier this morning, are increasingly formalistic about precisely what that means and have no necessary connection to the social movement that gave rise to the idea of building them in as bureaucrats in the first place. They are, to my mind, the Title IX enforcers, a problem for feminists now. And so do we want that? Or put it this way, if we want it, how could we learn from the bad aspects of getting this kind of expertise and this cold enforcement going under an emancipatory project? So I'm ambivalent about this. I don't know, but I want to say it's a rocky road there.
Yeah. Deroy, you wanted to say something?
Sure. This involves, I hope I'm getting the name right, a young man named Grant. I know the first name is Grant. I think it's Grant Neal. I'm not certain that that's his last name. I think it's Grant Neal. A young man who happens to be black, football player at University of Colorado, Pueblo. And he engaged in a consensual sexual relationship with a female student on campus. They liked each other. They enjoyed each other's company. At some point, she said, okay, you got to put on a condom. He did. They proceeded. She was very happy with that. And apparently they were quite content. Everyone was very happy. They woke up together. Everybody was thrilled. Later that day, one of this woman's friends saw a hickey on her neck. She therefore assumed her friend was raped, went to the campus sexual harassment police. The machinery started. The young lady said, no, I wasn't raped. Grant's a very nice guy. I like him. He did everything I wanted. I woke up in his arms. I felt great. I felt empowered. And the response is, well, young lady, you don't know what you're saying. You were raped. The machinery and the tumbrils continued rolling forward. Grant Neal was thrown off campus despite this woman repeatedly saying, he didn't rape me. He's not a rapist. He's a wonderful young guy. Get off his butt. He's kicked off campus. Football scholarship taken away. No school wants him back because who wants to put a rapist on his campus even though he's not a rapist? And basically, once you hit the go button on that machinery, it's going to keep going nonstop. Part of what adds to this is a guidance letter from the U.S. Department of Education, which basically says, it's an extension of Title IX, that in these cases you no longer have to have a beyond a reasonable suspicion. I believe it's now preponderance of the evidence. I hope we're getting the standard of proof correct. Number one. Number two, you can't you can't introduce exculpatory evidence. Can't be represented in these hearings. A lot of restrictions that are applied in those cases wouldn't apply if this. Okay, well, I'm not a lawyer. I'll let the lawyers clean up the exact specifics here. But the gist of it is that the protections that, if this had happened off campus and the local police were brought in, a lot of the protections that Grant Neal would have had disappear once you're on campus. Much of that goes away. Now, I think that if we are going to have any limitations on this, the Department of Education needs to do one of two things. Preferably, if we do have any changes in Title IX, they ought to be done by statute by Congress. If we're not willing to do that, at least they should follow the standard regulatory rulemaking procedure where they suggest a change in the rules. You then have a public comment period. People can exchange back and forth. Usually the people who are writing these regulations say, okay, we didn't think about that. Okay, we'll rewrite it a little bit. Rather than somebody just sit down, write a letter, send it out across the country without either Congress or any rulemaking procedure going through it, and that one letter out of somebody's computer suddenly becomes new federal law. I consider that tyrannical.
It's just crazy to say that 2011 letter was just like, sorry, I didn't mean to say you were crazy, but like that. There's he's referring to, I believe, to a 2011 Department of Education Dear Colleague letter, which was sent across the country, which was giving campuses much clearer directions than they previously had. And it did change certain things, but it wasn't something that was casually produced on a whim. I think there was a slight suggestion that was like, that was something that was done without input from people who've been, working on these things and thinking about them. And
there was no
regulatory procedure. There's a standard regulatory procedure that should be followed in these cases. They didn't do that.
Well, it's not their process, is my understanding. They've issued these letters before, and I think many of them have been fine. And this one had some consequences that I don't think were necessarily intended. It didn't include language affirming academic freedom, which previous such letters had. I mean, my feeling on this is, Title IX long predates this whole debate and was enacted, I'm not the expert, but to initially the impetus was really to equalize access to athletic opportunities on campus, and it had a huge impact on that. In recent years, there's been a big focus on using it as a tool to address assault and harassment, and that's become very important. I think we all agree it's an imperfect tool on that score, important but in need of a lot of refinement. I think when you think of questions of race or other, some of the other challenges we've talked about, this is the hammer we have that we've used, in the gender equality context. Is it the right tool, for this now? And I think a lot of what we're talking about today is about how you include more voices on campus, how a larger swath of students feel like they're fully able to participate. And we've talked about a lot of different measures to achieve that. I don't know that this is the best one. I certainly worry about what Janet said, which is you're going to replicate the shortcomings and the problems of this tool if you adopt it in another sphere. I would say, though, I think if we don't become more cognizant of the challenges of diversity, inclusion, and equality on campus and have a more robust effort to address those consistent with free speech protections, there's going to be a move for this kind of thing, whatever form it takes. Like, that will come. Someone's going to propose this unless kind of collectively we can get ahead of it and end this polarizing debate with the free expression advocates on one side, the diversity advocates on the other, and kind of the very little ability to find common ground and take concrete steps to move the campus forward.
Okay, we're going to have one legal point of order, and then Annie.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Just wanted to clear up a couple of things legally about the Dear Colleague letter, which is a 2011 letter sent out by the Department of Education. It does not prohibit introducing exculpatory evidence. It actually is the only piece of federal law or policy that gives students the right to present exculpatory evidence, which means that a student who is accused of rape has more robust protections than the roommate who is accused of punching someone in the face. The Dear Colleague letter does not say that students can't be represented. It actually says that if one party is allowed to be represented, so is the other. And I also just want to note that the Supreme Court has been very clear that student discipline proceedings do not need to replicate the procedures of criminal law because of the different goals, the different consequences, and the different resources available in the student discipline context.
I just want to make a couple quick observations. I couldn't let the intersectionality thing go by because I think that the notion that it's ever possible for anyone to be in a body that isn't simultaneously raced and sexed and gendered is completely incoherent. There is no way that sex can ever operate in a vacuum that doesn't somehow touch on race, no matter, that's not just for people of color. I mean, that's just, the idea of that is, so I've never really even understood that. And then the other sort of conceptual thing that I want to throw out that isn't, in a way, for me, this isn't even really ideological, but maybe more aesthetic, I don't know, is this notion that what you said when you talked about the idea that we should be in this sort of happy state of kind of, immediately I just...
Sexual community in which we're working towards each other's happiness.
Right, and like, of course, because I teach FISM, again, I thought of Kant and the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, and this is like the Kantian categorical imperative of sex. But at the same time, it's also sort of...
Something he said it was impossible.
Well, right, yeah. This is something that I think about. Just what about where you learn, kind of how to be this perfect subject, that just is born knowing, hello, you're a person of color? Oh, I will not commit a microaggression against you, There's something so absurd about this that I think, what you were saying, there needs to be a way to get at it, but I also feel like, where's the space to stumble, to learn? I mean, it's sort of a college, but then we're even expecting students to come here and sort of already know by the time they get here to be a combination of Judith Butler, Frantz Fanon, Gayatri Spivak, and, I don't know.
Greg, you want to?
Yeah, before we get too far away from the previous panel, there was something that you said in the previous panel that I really, I was like, yes, absolutely, that I've brought up several times when talking about the Title IX issues, which does trouble me. Because one of the stats that is actually pretty strong is that people who commit rape tend to be repeat offenders. That one's been pretty, I think that's a fairly robust stat. And one thing that I do find really troubling about the way we handle sexual assault on campuses is the fact that that it is the stats that you talked about earlier is that the people who disproportionately suffer from sexual assault are women between the ages of actually I thought it was 15 to 25, but maybe it's 15 to 30. And as you said, they're actually in greater risk off campus. So I think and to me, the fact that class keeps on dropping out of the conversation is something that I find maddening. And I said this very, very to someone who worked at the Office of Civil Rights. I'm like, so what you're saying is that you're focusing, some of the schools that they're focusing on are, for the most part, elite colleges at the Office of Civil Rights. And you're saying, so what we're going to do is we're going to take someone who's likely to rape again, we're going to kick them out of, I don't know, Bard. And basically that's great because that means they'll be preying on the person in the local bar. So it seems to be this incredibly sort of like flawed classes system, and I haven't really gotten a good answer to the idea of like it does end up seeming like this sort of like almost police system for the elite, but who gives a damn about people who aren't actually going to college, which I think is a kind of perverse result.
Okay, well, I want to. Can I switch the topic and maybe it'll come back a little bit? It's going to be related. I wanted to come back, if it's all right, to Angus's point where he took me to task earlier on the question of trauma. Right. So we've been talking about Title IX and violence, but there's also a lot that's about we've heard the words microaggressions, trauma, trigger warnings, etc. I find the trauma discussion really important. I mean, to me, that's very central to a lot of what's going on. I take trauma very, I really do. I know people who suffer from it. It's debilitating. I do worry that it's being misused. It's a medical word, right? I've talked to a number of medical doctors and psychologists about it, and what they tell me is that it needs to be treated. And if someone's suffering from a trauma, what you learn not to have to avoid it. You learn how to confront it and engage it. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't want to. But it does strike me that the use of the word trauma as a way to say we can't talk about this, it's unsafe, it's emotionally injuring, is expanding to the point where many of the people who are saying that they're traumatized. And this is a very hard thing to say. Are they really traumatized? I mean, what does that mean, right? It's a very hard thing to say, but I think it's a question that can't be. And we could come to the conclusion that if someone claims they're traumatized and believes they are, then they should be excused. But does that mean we should not have the speakers for others? And does that mean that it becomes a general, we don't let those people speak because of the trauma of some? So I just thought maybe Angus wanted to respond, and then if other people want to say, because to me, a lot of this issue, I find it becomes a medical discourse. The medical discourse does become something that is very hard to respond to, because how can you tell someone that they are or not suffering from trauma, right? I'm not willing to say that usually. So, but it then becomes like, how do we have a talk? How do we have a conversation about it?
Absolutely, and I think there are a few different things to unpack in what you just said. I think the first thing that's really important to say is that in the vast majority of these kinds of situations where these questions come up on the campus, it is fairly rare, and I'm not going to say it's non-existent because Greg will yell at me, but it is fairly rare that students are asking for something to disappear from the campus because of their trauma. They're asking for it to be treated in a certain way or handled in a certain way because of the potential for trauma. And even where students have made certain demands about being excused from assignments and that kinds of thing, once you propose alternatives to them that allow them to interact with the material in a different kind of a way, they tend to be very responsive to that. My trigger warning that I use in my classes does not allow you to skip an assignment. And because of that, I've had a lot of critics of trigger warnings come to me and say, well, that's not a real trigger warning. And so, you say you're pro-trigger warnings, but you're not really. And no student who is an advocate for trigger warnings has ever said that to me. And in fact, some of the students who are most sort of parodistically portrayed as being enemies of freedom of speech have written to me privately or talked to me publicly about how they think that my approach is a good one. So I think that one of the things that is having to happen here is that people are coming out of the closet with their experiences of trauma, their experiences of mental illness, cognitive issues across a wide variety of contexts. And what's happening is that people who would have otherwise fallen through the cracks, people who would have otherwise had to suffer in silence, people who would have otherwise have had to leave higher education, are standing up and saying, this institution needs to bend a bit, because I'm bending a hell of a lot. The institution needs to bend as well. As far as the question of people, claiming the mantle of trauma when they're not experiencing trauma, in a lot of cases, I think the practices to accommodate students who may experience trauma are actually just good pedagogical practices overall. And so if you can construct classroom practices that are good for everybody, you don't wind up with the sort of free rider problem that you're describing. That can be an issue, and it's worth discussing in certain circumstances. But in my classroom in particular, I construct it so that there isn't an incentive to claim because I'm constructing something that's going to be useful for people across a wide variety of experiences.
Just one quick follow-up to you. It seems to me that your policy is eminently reasonable, right? And I have a similar one. I don't call it a trigger warning, but I say similar things. Sometimes. But I mean, it depends on the class, depends on things. What's the problem with common sense as opposed to requiring it? And is it that it's not being done well enough? Because it seems to me like you're using common sense.
Well, I think I'm doing, well, I would like to say that I'm using common sense, but what I'm doing, I wasn't doing 3 years ago. And I mean, I would do some stuff, but
it's not required by your university.
It's not required by my university, right. But the reason I'm doing it is I had a series of very long conversations with a good friend of mine who has PTSD from, she's a combat veteran.
Right.
And she had dropped out of higher education because of her negative experiences with professors around issues of combat-related trauma. And we had a series of conversations where I was like, well, what would you want your professors to say? And some of the stuff that she wanted professors to say, I was like, I can't really do that, but what would this work as an alternative, and that kind of thing. So I think that it's really important to open the discussion, and I think it's really important to provide faculty with training and suggestions and advice and information around this stuff, because we all know that faculty in general get very, very little training in teaching, period. Never mind, it's the reality, right? Many, many people wind up in a college classroom without having had any formal training in teaching. And so to expect faculty to have common sense around these fairly complicated and fairly novel issues is difficult as well. I do think, though, that the question of whether these things are going to be mandated is coming. I think it's coming more quickly than I was expecting it to be. I used to say this is not something that is ever happening as a mandated thing. People are beginning to talk about it, and I think those are going to be complicated conversations, but I welcome those conversations.
So I saw Janet and Suzanne were to...
So I have no idea what the range is, Angus, but in the particular place where I teach, which is a law school, and where, I mean, my basic line is we wouldn't have a law school if people weren't really horrible to each other. So everything that we teach almost is gruesome. And so I'm happy to give a trigger warning to my whole course and to make accommodations for particular students, and I'm totally with the idea that the material can get to be too much for particular people. I also want to be able to say, though, that ideologically driven curricular reform agendas launched under voicing of vicarious trauma that someone else might feel, that you can't talk about this issue the way I don't want to have to hear it. It won't work in a law school because you have to you have to prepare students to go into court and have those arguments said by the lawyer on the other side. And we just fight it semester at my law school, semester after semester after semester. Feminists are fleeing the curriculum of criminal law because of the pressure, the emails, that you didn't do it right. And I think that there's more of a problem than you may be experiencing in your pedagogical setting. In my setting, it's really risking almost like the truth value of the class for owning the horror of the material that we actually have to deal with.
If I could say one more quick thing and then I'll shut up for good. I agree with you, and I think that is a real thing. I think in my conversations around this, feminist professors, women who are feminist professors, and particularly women of color, have different pressures on them around this stuff in a variety of ways than I do as a white guy, and those things are real. And I it's like the old saying from church, all prayers are answered, and sometimes the answer is no. One of the things that faculty need to be able to do, and when I say need, I mean personally need and institutionally need, they need to be able to say, you know what, that is not an accommodation that I can grant. They need to have institutional support for that. They need to have best practices for that. But also, one of the things that, and I'm probably going to offend some people here, but I'm overdue. I'm an adjunct professor at a community college, right? I am somebody who takes a lot of risks in a risky situation. I don't have a huge amount of sympathy. I have some, but I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for tenured professors who lie awake unable to sleep because they're afraid that a student might lodge a complaint against them, which is overwhelmingly likely to be thrown out. The reality is faculty have a tremendous amount of institutional power, and right now a lot of faculty are, I think, a lot more afraid of their students than the evidence justifies.
A couple points. I mean, one thing that added to my understanding of this issue was a study that came out just this year about the original PTSD, combat-related PTSD, and the fact that increasingly scientists and doctors are finding that it's physiological. Like there's some, in being shocked by proximity to a blast, there's something that changes in your brain, and that has a lot to do with the subsequent and lingering experience of trauma from combat. And what that says to me is like it's something very different from all these other forms of trauma, whether it's rape or illness-related or sexual abuse, any other kind of form. So I think we do a disservice by conflating them. And, I do think the answer is something closer to sensitivity and awareness, because what I worry about is it's not the professor lying awake kind of worried about saying something and having a complaint. It's the chilling effect, and it's the chilling effect that goes together with the chilling effect caused by some of the misuse of Title IX, even though it may be used properly 90% of the time. These incidents that have been well documented are enough to put a lot of professors, and whether adjuncts have the worst of it because they have the least protection, on notice that you have to be very careful. And even if the complaint is adjudicated in your favor, the reputational damage that you suffer. I mean, someone like Laura Kipnis, vindicated, but you Google her and this is the story you get. Her whole professional identity is framed by this. The same is true of her complainants, and that's one of the things that's made the experience so traumatic for them. They were very reluctant to bring this complaint in the first place for fear of that, and the confidentiality protections of Title IX didn't protect them for various reasons, and her article may have had something to do with that. So it boomeranged on both sides, and I think that chilling effect, which I think Janet is getting at, what's happening in the law schools, just can't be dismissed, because I think it impoverishes the dialogue for everybody, and most of all the students.
Yeah, I want to add to that and sort of echo some comments that have been made here. It seems to me that, and perhaps this is my bias, which is that part of what the work of the classroom is to prepare people to be agents of their own change or transformation. It's not that we're pouring knowledge into them, but rather that we're activating something that will help them to be advocates or agents. So to say that, you know, so I understand the sensitivity piece, and I'm interested in the ways that you both make it possible for people to participate who might have wounds. But it seems to me that part of that recovery is also being somehow able to sort of look at what is wounding them and to be agents, to reposition themselves somehow in relation to that wounding, that harm, that injury. And so I want to pick up on what you've said too, Janet, which is that it would be terrible if we had no women who were prosecuting rape cases because they can't bear to hear the stuff that has happened, where rape has happened as a weapon of war, right? But they can't hear it because it's and then finally, it seems to me that's part of recovery, right, is to become an advocate. That is like, I think therapeutically it's considered in some schools to be one of the final stages of recovery, which is why I describe meshing, by the way, because that comes out of a movement of creating advocates, not of people who are continually re-wounded, but actually how do you activate the person? And so meshing becomes the way that they come back from the harm into a sense of agency.
So we're almost done. We're going to have a couple final comments. So these will be your final comments. Annie?
I just want to make a quick comment. I love what you said, Erica. And just very quickly, when I was an undergrad, you know, racist stuff happens, sexist stuff, whatever. So I was in a poetry class, and there was a woman who was reading what she thought was poems written in Black English, and there were lines in the poems like "Cocoa boy, brown flower playing in the urban jungle." I can still remember it. But so instead of going to some office and making a complaint, I came to class and I talked about the tradition of writing poetry in Black English. I talked about Paul Laurence Dunbar and things like that. She completely fell apart and started crying and never came back to class. I then went and talked to Frank Bedard, whose class it was, and I said, you know, was that okay what I did? You know, she got really upset, and he was just like, oh, yes, but no. And, you know, I felt great. I mean, she didn't feel that good, I guess, but there's a big difference between that and, you know, I'm going to do some sort of elaborate bureaucratic thing. I mean, hopefully she was able to learn from it too. But, you know, the fact that I just kind of did it was great. And I feel like sometimes things are in the way of students just addressing things in the classroom when it happens, because,
I'm neither a combat veteran nor a university professor, so allow me to comment on this PTSD in the classroom situation. I understand the comment you made about sensitivity, and I think that's important. I would be concerned, however, if instead of saying, okay, you are suffering from PTSD, so you can handle the assignment differently, if we take go the next step further, which is, well, all right, we'll just cancel All Quiet on the Western Front and take that off the syllabus, and nobody has to read it. And then not only does the student with PTSD not read the book, nobody in the class reads the book. I think it's usually better if there's a problem with speech to have more speech, and additional speech will drive out the confused speech or fill in the gaps of ignorance or whatever. In a case like this, if let's say, I'm just going to use All Quiet on the Western Front as an example, maybe that is an opportunity for the student who has PTSD to use that as an opportunity for additional therapy, to compare what happened in that book with what that person experienced. And perhaps if the student is able to get up and talk about it, say, look, we read about this case in World War I. Here's my experience from Iraq or Afghanistan and how I experienced that and how that's had an impact on me. I was very moved this morning to hear the remarks about the woman who said that she had sex with a black man while she was on acid, and she's looked back on that and seen it as something that might have been rape, although she didn't think it was at the time, and so on and so forth. It was very educational for me to hear this firsthand experience, and I think if I were in a classroom and we all read All Quiet on the Western Front and had one of our colleagues get up and say, here's what it feels like in 2016 or 2014 or 2013 rather than 1950 1915, 1916, that could be very educational for everybody. So it might be an opportunity for additional learning rather than something which would cause a student to recoil.
I thought I saw you wanted to say something. No? No, I'm good. Okay. Alexandra. Next. You get the last.
So if Alex is going last, I do want to say I think the 2000 letter violates the Administrative Procedure Act. I just want to get one legal point in there. But the 2011 DCL, Dear Colleague letter, violated the Administrative Procedure Act. That's currently being tested in law, but we'll see. But when it comes to, but I just want to make a point about trigger warnings. What Angus does is something that I have a lot of respect for. It involves a very intimate connection with his students. I do, however, think that one of the things that it is one of these things where people are talking about different versions of the same topic. And the topic where it really showed more what Janet was talking about was the kind of trigger warning policy they tried to pass at Oberlin. Because the one they had at Oberlin that the professors immediately freaked out at was this advisory not to cover the following topics, but if you have to, provide warnings. And what they listed was racism, classism, sexism, colonialism, all these things that basically generally people don't, a number of topics that generally people don't have PTSD in relationship to, classism, for example, or else you'd be in very serious trouble because classism is everywhere. And the professors freaked out at it because they're like, "Holy shit! What am I going to be able to teach if this is the whole list?" So I do think that I always, whenever I talk about this issue, I always say, one, it's a violation of academic freedom to require them. Two, I think it's a violation of academic freedom to say that professors can't have them. But when it comes to the science behind it, right now we don't know if trigger warnings are helpful to people with PTSD. We do have some mainstream people like Richard McNally talking about there is actually potential harm, particularly if you're not doing, if that's the only thing you're doing not doing enough to help somebody. And then three, there's a concern about the academic environment. And we need more research on it to try to figure it out. And am I willing to change my stance on it? Actually, it's always been predicated on the idea of needing some more information about it.
I'm not. Sorry.
Okay.
I just
Jennifer's
felt
changed
like
her mind. She wants to
I think because I don't know how much my affect radiates like outside and if it's visible. Because it's like there are these moments when I feel like it's like porcupine things are just like popping right out of me, and I need to mesh. Yeah, and I just want to say, like, because it's not every day I'm on a platform with feminist legal scholars who have so much concrete knowledge and understanding of the law and the administration of the law. And I appreciate that because, frankly, the things that we read the most and the headlines that we read the most on these facts are not coming from those places. They're ideologically driven and partial and tend to minimize the complexity and the difficulty of all of these issues. So if I reacted very strongly and negatively to some of the things that you said that was coming from years of frustration of seeing a really difficult subject flattened out into a simple controversy so that it really is like treating our lives like clickbait. And that is a sentence that I used when a blogger writing for the AAUP reproduced a document that's part of a harassment case in my own department. Just reproduced this person's document as if it was a story, dragged a quite painful ongoing crisis in my department out into the blogosphere, right? And then there's a story in Inside Higher Ed, and you can dive into the miserable world of the gutter of internet commentary on sexual harassment case, and imagine what it's like to be part of the community that's impacted in that, and know that you know nothing about the story, nothing about it. Right? And that most of what you read about harassment cases is it's surface and partial and just a slice of some of the worst moments in a community's life, right? And it just, you feel used by that kind of stuff, So I think I just wanted to say that's that there's like a kind of a casual tossing around like that. The 2011 Dear Colleague letter, whatever you're going to say about it, and I have major issues with whole parts of it, but it's actually allowed a lot of things to happen that weren't happening before that are really good. And the fact is that it can be an easier, it's almost like if you have a racist and a sexist in your department, you're lucky that he's also the latter, right? Because there are easier ways to kind of, if you have a racist and a sexist in your department, right? And I'm just speaking hypothetically. right? Who's an aggressive and disruptive member of a working community in an academic environment, it's easier to actually handle a Title IX complaint in a certain way, in terms of you'll activate a sense of urgency on the administration's part that it does not have around racism. I just don't see it. You know, and so like you can actually use the apparatus of Title IX to make something happen, right? And I think when people express a longing for something like Title IX, that's the part they want, is the sense of urgency, right? Now the problem is that sense of urgency is actually motivated by a lot of really problematic things, and it's an ugly process, and you know, there's lots about it that are not admirable and not things that you would want to import into anything as important as creating an anti-racist working environment. You know, but I do think there are useful tools in that, and the fact that the government actually cares enough to issue guidelines nationally is actually important. These are guidelines; it's not law, right? Right. So, but anyway, I just want to say that's all. Yeah, no, sorry. I was like not.
I think
I'm not representing.
lawyers can have an APA argument maybe afterward. But you know, I started by this morning talking about my defense of having separate school responses to gender violence, and Greg's question sort of brought this back up again. So, I'd like to answer it. So, first of all, not only people with privilege go to school. A lot of people go to school. You know, we'll remember Title IX applies to K through 12 schools as well. It is not just the last couple of years that we've realized that it also has to do with sexual harassment. Schools have been on notice at least since 1980. So, second, education is particularly important, as I would imagine someone from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education would recognize. And so, addressing sex-based obstacles to education is particularly important. Third, we have a legal regime that provides multiple remedies to people who have been harmed. In the same way that a student who has been punched in the face can report that to the school and also go to the police if he or she wishes, a student who has been raped and just like a person who has been raped not on campus can file a civil tort suit or can report to the police. Here we have another example where a student who is raped on campus can file a tort suit, can go to the police, and or can file with a student discipline regime. And if you're going to have that regime and you're going to have a civil rights mandate, I would hope that the federal government would be involved in making it better. And so I don't think that that the federal government is simply intervening for the privileged. I also want to say that it is hard. Okay, so like clause out. There are a lot of people who disagree with me on fundamental questions about Title IX who I've been able to engage with very productively over the years. It is difficult for me to engage with representatives from FIRE assuming good faith when the push is always for fewer options for survivors and not for more, and when much of the organization's argument grounds the attack on Title IX in skepticism about the magnitude and importance of the problem. If we want to make sure that everyone has a civil rights remedy in the wake of gender violence, let's push for state civil rights remedies, as a number have passed in the wake of Morrison when the federal civil rights remedy was struck down, to ensure that everyone has these options rather than deciding that because only a couple have access that none should.
Just a couple of quick things, which I think will help to move us toward wrapping up. In the case of the Oberlin proposal, which was withdrawn, it was a recommendation. There was no intent that it was ever going to be a requirement. But I think it's also important to note that the idea that somebody could bring up, for instance, sexually disturbing content in a classroom in a gratuitous way that should be avoided is not completely beyond the realm of possibility, right? There are faculty who enjoy shocking their students. And so if you're in an economics class, they're going to say, so imagine you're a hooker, and go on and do 15 minutes about how you're going to be pricing your wares as a prostitute, right? That kind of attitude from faculty, and they can be even worse and even more gross than that. I see a lot of people nodding. that kind of behavior can be incredibly alienating for students in the classroom. And so a suggestion that, you know what, maybe don't do that, think about whether you should do that, is not an entirely unreasonable suggestion. I'd also like to note that the brouhaha over trigger warnings began in large part, not entirely, but in large part, with the case of Columbia, where students were complaining about rape themes in ancient Greek texts. And it became this sort of caricatured thing throughout the media. But what happened in that situation was that the students were concerned that the professor in their class was teaching these texts which addressed the issue of rape and was essentially glossing over the fact that there was sexual violence in these texts. And when they went to him individually to try and get this situation resolved, he blew them off. And he wouldn't address their concerns, and he wouldn't go to work with them on this. And even at that point, they did not call for mandatory trigger warnings. They called for a campus-wide discussion about how the student-faculty relationship around these issues of sexual violence in the classroom could be better addressed. So I think one of the things that's really important for us to remember is that while we would love to see a lot of these things be addressed informally, and I think in many cases that's a really good outcome, a lot of students are doing this. And a lot of the cases that come to our attention are a result of that process being tried and in one way or another failing.
I'm going to ask that we continue this conversation over wine and food. First I want to thank all of our speakers from today who are joined us again on this panel very much. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you all for staying for a long day. I think it's been an eye-opening day. I hope you've had some things where you were surprised, maybe a little disturbed. That was the hope. Not, I hope, in a bad way, but in a way that you had your mind challenged. That's the hope here. We will convene tomorrow at 9:30. We're starting 9:30 tomorrow morning. We're going to try and end by 5, a little earlier. So please join us again tomorrow, and we'll see you then. Thank you all very much for coming.